Cable needles are overrated. A waste of time. No, it's the yarn's fault. I'm happy to purl. Let's get into some possibly controversial opinions. So I love seeing like other people's controversial knitting opinions, hot takes videos, and I thought I would give my own go because yeah, we all have opinions and stuff like that on our hobby, what works, what doesn't, and yes, so let's dive into them. Hey folks, if you're new here, I'm Dawn. This is Tangled Together, where I talk about my knitting hobby and the other things in life that get tangled up in it. So I'm going to sit here and knit and share with you my controversial opinions. I am currently working on a Staffen Light. I'll put some of the project details up here. And I'm using Knit Picks Melisa sock yarn in Amaranth Flower. Hi, Ripley. Ripley just sniffed the, hi. I'm doing the 4-ply, the fingering weight version, and I'm loving the fabric it's making with this. Very excited to have this done. All right, let's start off with some of the hot takes. Starting off with magic loop. I don't think magic loop is magical. There are definitely a handful of projects that I have used magic loop for that have worked out well, and I'm glad I used magic loop. But in general, I don't really like magic loop. I will say my experience with magic loop definitely changed when I tried doing it with the Chow needles with the red cord. That definitely much improved over some other kinds of needles and cords. You definitely need a flexible cord and a long enough cord. However, I don't know. Even with the Chow needles, it felt very awkward to me. I never really got a great hang of doing the magic loop, and it didn't feel like it saved any time. You hear licking noises is because both dogs have decided now is the time to clean themselves while sitting right next to me. Hi. Yes, I'm talking about you. That wasn't an invitation to come over. Oh, okay. My preferred method is 2 needles. I use 2 circular needles, of oftentimes a shorter length. I've used this to knit socks. I've used this to knit sleeves of sweaters and stuff like that. And I find it just works really great. I just knit across one sleeve or one needle, and then I get to knit across the next needle. And I don't find that I have as much laddering as I have had the couple times that I've tried doing magic loop. I've never really been able to get rid of the laddering with magic loop, but for whatever reason, I don't run into that with 2-column knitting or 2 needle, circular needle knitting. I have also used double pointed needles for socks and hats and some other smaller projects, and I don't mind them, but when given the chance, I will definitely use the 2 needles. Cable needles are overrated. I have tried a number of different cable needles. I've tried the kind that has that straight line and then bend, both in metal and in wood. I've got a couple cable needles that they're just straight, but they've got these little notches in them. I don't like those because I find it very hard to slide the yarn on and off. Honestly, what I use when I need a cable needle is a double pointed needle. I usually in a slightly smaller size than the needle that I'm knitting on, and I just use that. I've successfully tried doing 2 stitch cables where you just are switching one stitch over the other without a cable needle. I have tried using doing the no needle cable needle with some slightly larger cables, and I just always have felt nervous that I'm going to drop stitches or things are going to unravel. So I just use a double pointed needle instead of cable needles. it works for me. I think a top-down sweater is a better construction. There are a number of bottom-up sweaters and shirts, especially like summer stuff, that I think are gorgeous and I would love to make, but I always just feel more comfortable doing a top-down. I always feel like the fit ends up being better. I can kind of try it on and see how it's fitting and everything. I also feel like maybe top down is a little bit more comfortable of a thing if you have a more significant difference between your upper bust and bust measurement, because I feel like this area, it's a little bit easier to tell when you're doing top down how well it's going to fit versus bottom up, because the like couple of projects that I've done that are bottom up, one of them I frogged last year because I realized like the armholes were way too big and I had just done like the strap way too long, but I didn't realize that until I got like to the very end. And yes, granted, I could have just like frogged out maybe a couple of rows, but yeah, I feel like, I don't know, just the projects that I have done that are top down, I have been much more, I have been happier with. I think toe up socks are better. Again, you can kind of try them on a little bit as you go. And I don't know, I prefer the way they feel on my foot. Now, I haven't done a ton of socks, so this is something that I actually kind of want to experiment with a little bit more and figure out like, what toe method do I like the best? What heel method do I like the best? Maybe it's just the particular toes and heels I've done with top down socks, cuff down. I haven't been a huge fan of. I've liked all the cuff down socks that I've made, like the design of them. There's just some of the like, yeah, the way the heel turn works, and sometimes I'm just nervous about getting the correct size, whereas I feel a little bit more confident with the size doing toe up. So perhaps that's something that my opinion will change in the future as I get more comfortable with socks or discover what particular, toe heel combo I prefer the most. But for now, I think toe up is superior. I don't always gauge swatch. I don't think you always have to gauge swatch for every single pattern. Now, that's not to say don't gauge swatch. Gauge swatching is a waste of time. No, I don't gauge swatch for every project. If I'm doing a scarf, I don't gauge swatch. If I'm doing, oftentimes hats, I don't gauge swatch, because if it's like smaller projects like hats, you've even done like some mittens, and like even sometimes with socks, I don't bother gauge swatching because I can figure out pretty early on if the gauge is just completely off. And with things like mittens and hats, if it's slightly off, it doesn't feel like it creates as big of an issue. Whereas for garments, I do try and always gauge swatch for adult garments, because I feel like I'm going to put in that much time. I want to make sure that I'm picking the correct size and I'm knitting, is it something that like, oh, it's going to grow or stretch out, so I need to keep that in mind. Is it going to shrink up? Just to keep that in mind as I'm knitting it, so that I also get like the correct length that I want. Now, you'll notice that I mentioned adult garments. I haven't gauge swatched for most of the sweaters, if not all of the sweaters, that I have knit my daughter. Now, she is 4 and still fits into like 3T, some 2T clothes. She is very small. So knitting a sweater for her, like I've knit a sweater for her in a week. Knitting a sweater for her is usually a little bit of a less huge time commitment. And I also have tended to do patterns that have a oversized are oversized. I like that with kids and toddlers stuff because they can kind of grow into it, especially if it's something that's going to take a little bit more time. You're not trying to guess, okay, if this is going to take me 2 months, how big are they going to be in 2 months? Like, I'd rather that it's a little bit big and we roll up the sleeves than, oh no, this doesn't fit. So with that, like, I haven't gauge swatched, but once I get, like, if I'm doing a top down, once I get the neckline done and get like a little bit of of the back done, I'll kind of do a rough gauge swatch. I won't block it and let it dry and do all of that, but I'll at least measure, okay, how close do I think I am to the actual gauge that it's supposed to be, and then I might make adjustments. I do encourage you to gauge swatch, especially if you're working with a new kind of yarn that you aren't really familiar with how it's going to act. If you're doing a really big project that you want to make sure fits, especially if it's something that it has a little bit more of a tailored fit to it that isn't supposed to be oversized, because I also feel like oversized gives you a little bit more wiggle room. The difference of like, oh, if it's supposed to have 8 inches of positive ease and I got 7 or 6 inches of positive ease, like that's still going to have that oversized fit. Maybe not quite as oversized, but it's not going to be quite as problematic of like, well, this is supposed to have 2 inches of positive ease and I'm at 0 inches of positive ease. I feel like that is a lot more noticeable. So yeah, I don't always gauge swatch. Hand-dyed yarn always looks better in the hank. I have picked up a number of hand-dyed yarns that are gorgeous, that I loved them in the hank. And when I've started working them up, I haven't loved them. Some of them I feel like would look really great in crochet, but when I knit them up, it's just too busy, or the color doesn't distribute itself well. This is something that I feel like is more of something that I need to learn a little bit better, maybe less of like a hot take of it's the yarn's fault, and more I just need to learn a little bit more of like how to utilize that yarn, what kind of projects it would work best in, and being able to look at a hank of yarn and actually like anticipate how the color is going to get distributed. I love the idea of hand-dyed colorful yarn, but practicality, I think I'm much more of a solids and tonals and tweeds type person than necessarily like super colorful variegated yarn. I think Petite Knit is a little overrated. Now, this is coming from somebody who has made a number of Petite Knit things. I'm wearing a Petite Knit sweater. This is her Ava cardigan. I think Petite Knit does really great basics. However, I do sometimes feel like her patterns might be a little overpriced, and it's mainly because there's no schematic. Very few of her patterns. I think actually like the Kids Dagmar Jr. was one of the first patterns I've done or seen of hers that actually had a schematic in it. And I think that's something that more designers need to have in their patterns, because just going off of, well, what is the bust size to figure out your sizing, that makes it really hard to make sure you're knitting something that's really going to fit you, because especially if you have different proportions than the person that pattern was designed for. It's a lot harder to like, okay, I'll add in some bust darts, or maybe I'll knit the sleeves a little bit shorter, like knowing if you have all of those schematics that you can look at and compare that to your body and compare it to clothing that you wear that you really like the look of. You just can't do that. And I have felt like there have been the couple of Petite Knit patterns I have made, This one I did pretty much to pattern, but the storm sweater I did alter it. I cropped it. And this one I feel like turned out like the sleeves are definitely bigger than I expected. I was going for a little bit of an oversized cardigan look, and that, was what the pattern kind of was. But I also was not expecting to have this much extra room in the sleeves. I was expecting the sleeves to be a little bit more fitted. And yeah, I get the people that don't like petite knit. I get the people that think it's overrated. There also are some times where I see the same kind, basically pattern, but okay, here's the T version of the long sleeve, or here's the half zip of this, like, almost identical, just turtleneck sweater, that I feel like a lot of other designers bundle those. Like Rebecca Clow has a lot of like, well, here's the sleeveless and the short sleeve, or people will have, here's instructions on how to do a short sleeve, here's instructions on how to do a long sleeve, especially like short sleeve and long sleeve isn't a big difference in the core pattern. And so sometimes it feels a little like, looking at some of her patterns, I'm like, what's the difference really between these two that makes it need to buy a whole new pattern? She's a designer. She's got to make money off of selling her designs. I get that. But I get the like criticism. And yeah, I do kind of agree that like Petite Knit is a little overrated. It makes really great basics. A number of the pieces that I've made from her, people have been like, oh, that looks so nice. I thought you just bought that sweater, which is nice to hear. But also like, sometimes you really want a sweater that looks like something you made, that looked like something that was handmade and not just machine created. Scarves are not good beginner projects. I think a hat's a really good beginner project. The reason I say scarves aren't good beginner projects is because you don't learn a whole lot of techniques. It's a good way to practice just, going back and forth, knitting and purling, or doing a garter stitch, whatever it is. It also takes a long time. It takes so long to knit a scarf. Whereas like a hat, you're working in the round. So for some people, that's a lot easier. And you can usually make a hat in like, with a skein or two's worth of yarn. You can probably do it maybe even in a weekend. So you get that like dopamine of like, look, I did the thing. I made this cool thing, without spending a month on it. And I think that's good. That's better to introduce people to the joys of knitting, to be like, yeah, you can create stuff and it doesn't take forever. And also I'm not a huge scarf person. Maybe I need to try and wearing more scarves, but I think hats are a much better beginner project for a knitter. This feels appropriate because I'm purling right now. I don't think purling's that bad. I know I've seen some people who like avoid patterns because it has a ton of purling, or, complain about how much longer purling takes. Maybe that's something that is more of a like continental knitting, since I knit English, but I don't mind purling. I don't think it takes that much longer. Yeah, I don't get that. I don't get the purl hate. I'm happy to purl. Speaking of being an English style and not a continental knitter, I don't need to knit faster. I know I've heard people talk about like learning continental so that they can knit faster. I do kind of want to learn continental for color work, to be able to like hold one color in one hand and one color in the other. But I learned English style knitting and I'm fine with it. I'm fine with the speed that I knit at. I'm also like, I like having the finished object, and there's definitely some motivation of like, get something done in time to wear it during a certain season, but I am much more of the like process knitting. If I don't finish a project, I'm not devastated. Like a couple times I've had to frog a project or rip a section out because I did something wrong and had to start over. It's been a little bit of frustration of like, oh, there goes a month's worth of work that I've unraveled in 10 minutes. But also more knitting time for me. So yeah, I don't need to learn Continental just so I can knit faster. I am happy with the speed I knit. There is nothing wrong with acrylic yarn. I do think acrylic yarn has its purpose, and there are certain projects that I wouldn't make with acrylic yarn, and certainly some acrylic yarns that I don't want to use just because they're not great quality. It has a super plasticky feel. But there's plenty of good acrylic yarn out there, or acrylic blends, because it also like it has a purpose. I've made a couple of outfits of like sweaters for my kid out of acrylic yarn because it's so much easier to care for. It's so much more washable than 100% wool. So I don't have to worry about her wearing it and playing in the sandbox, or, oh, we have to take this off before you eat something in case you spill something on it. It definitely has its use. For people who have allergies to wool or various kinds of fiber, being able to use acrylic is great. If you're making home goods, I think acrylic yarn is great for home goods. There's nothing wrong with acrylic yarn. Every fiber has its purpose. However, plastic needles are awful. I've knit with plastic needles. I started out knitting with like a super cheap plastic needle set, and they feel squeaky and gross. I definitely priority-wise, like preferences-wise for knitting needles, it goes wood/bamboo, metal, plastic. It's not even on the chart. I mainly knit with wooden needles. I like the grippiness of them. I find my hands don't get quite as fatigued as quickly with wooden needles as they do with metal needles. However, I do use metal needles, especially for socks and lace for that like much smaller scale knitting. So there you go. Those are my knitting hot takes, knitting controversial opinions. Now, if you have a different opinion than me, great. We all have our own opinions on knitting. Like, do what works for you. Use the kind of yarn and kind of needles you like. Follow the designers that you like. It's all so personalized. And I think my main thing is like anybody in the hobby who's like, oh, if you use this kind of knitting needle, you're wrong. Or if you use this kind of yarn, you're wrong. Like, everybody's going to have different motivations. And perhaps there are reasons of like, oh, hey, this kind of metal needle might work better for this kind of project. Like, I feel like when it's offered in the, like, I'm sharing with my opinion or my experiences because I think it can help you, versus I'm sharing this because I'm judging you and trying to feel better than you. That's where I think sometimes these like hot takes and controversial opinions get to be problematic. I like watching them because sometimes I learn something. Sometimes I learn like, oh, I didn't think about trying to knit, until somebody mentioned like continental knitting with color work. I was like, I had never had any interest in learning continental knitting because English works fine for me. But as soon as they were like, oh yeah, you can hold one color yarn in one hand and one in the other, I was like, oh, that might make it a little bit easier. That's something that I'm interested in learning. So yeah, I hope maybe there's something in here that you learned. Maybe there's just something that you're glad that somebody else shares that same opinion, or maybe you don't share my opinion, and that's fine too. I'd love to know, what are your knitting hot takes or knitting controversial opinions, let's chat about them more in the comments below. And thank you so much for spending your time here with me. It really means a lot, getting to read everybody's comments and seeing that folks are watching these videos. I really appreciate that you've chosen to spend your time here with me. And stay tuned, because I'm going to be having like kind of a special bonus episode about reorganizing our bookcases behind me. Woo! If you want to keep up with some of my more day-to-day activities or check out some details on my projects, you can follow me on Instagram and Ravelry as well. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos, like the bookcase sort, if you're interested in that, or just more knitting stuff. All right, so I'm almost finished with another row, so I think it might be time to say farewell, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye! Can I stay?